right, everybody. Wow, this is an amazing crowd of people. I know that many of you are still kind of coming in, no worries. We're gonna be chatting over the lunch and learn time. So just keep coming in and getting some of that phenomenal food, and we'll get started with our presentation today. So my name is Dr. Megan Grega. I am a family doc here in the area, and I'm also board certified in something called lifestyle medicine. In addition to that, I'm the co-founder and chief medical officer of Kellen Foundation, and some of you may have met my phenomenal co-founder, Eric Ruth, who is around here somewhere. Where are you, Eric? I think you're supposed to be in this general vicinity. If you see a gentleman, there he is. If you see a gentleman walking around with a green t-shirt, that's my co-founder, Eric. And here in the Lehigh Valley, Kellen Foundation tries to basically promote making the healthy choice the easy choice through our healthy neighborhood immersion strategy. Now, we're not going to be talking a whole lot about that today, but if anybody's ever interested, please get in touch with us through our website, which is www.kellen.org. All right. So in addition to being the co-founder of Kellen, I also teach medical students and residents, and I am thrilled to have so many of all of you here as well to find out more about lifestyle medicine. So today we're going to be talking about cultivating resilience, why lifestyle medicine, or why lifestyle, I should say. So cultivating resilience, why lifestyle is the best medicine. And I'm just going to reset our timer here. Otherwise, we could just chat all day, I think. All right. So, unfortunately, we do have a lot of issues facing us. There's an epidemic of chronic disease in our society, alongside another epidemic of loneliness and isolation. We've got societal divisions fueled by misinformation and disinformation, and we've also got a lot of stressors from things like climate change and economic issues and weakening of the social contract that used to kind of tell us that we were all in this together. Now, Albert Einstein said, "You cannot solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created it," or created them, I should say. And what I would like to say is that is why today is such an important gathering. Having all of us together in the same room, in the same place, talking about ways that we can help move the needle to make our Lehigh Valley the healthiest, happiest, and hopefully most vital and long-living community that we possibly can. So I'm honored to be here with so many leaders and doers and passionate advocates, so we can think through some new ways forward where we can build a community where everyone can thrive. All right, so let's talk about our learning objectives. Today we're going to be talking about the relationship between lifestyle choices and chronic disease. We're also going to be looking at some of the research regarding the common characteristics of communities that have a high percentage of octogenarians and older inhabitants, which is what we would like to have here in the Valley. And then we're also going to be exploring strategies for increasing resilience, because resilience is important for our patients or our participants, but also for ourselves. And when you look at this picture up here on both sides, this is kind of the way I think about the way I would like to age, the way I think all of us would want to age, either for ourselves, for our family, for the people in our community, and that is growing older with vitality, still with having a sense of purpose, being able to do all the things that we want to do, spend time with our family or do the types of activities that are important to us. So if this is our goal, you know, kind of how we would like to age here in the Lehigh Valley and also in the United States as a whole, how are we doing with that? All right, so let's look at this. Well, we're definitely spending a lot of money on it, right? If you look at how much money the United States spends on healthcare every year, compared to our kind of reference countries, places like in Germany and France and Australia, we're definitely way up there at the top. Now, if you see us, we are up there at about $13,000, over $400 per person per year. And that's not just like healthcare, that's really pretty much sick care. So, as the United States, we're number one, right? We're spending the most amount of money that we possibly could, I guess, compared to everybody else. And that might be okay based on we're a relatively wealthy country, you know, so if we are getting a good return on investment for that money, it might be worth it. So for a moment, I would like all of you to participate in this to see what you guys think. We're going to do it the way that we do with our third graders when we go out in the elementary schools. Everybody put your hand out like this. Have your fist kind of like in the flat like this. Hand out. All right. If you think we are getting a good return on investment for that money, thumbs up. If you think we are not getting a good, we could do better, thumbs down. And if you are like, I don't know, it's complicated, you can put it in the middle. Let's see. I see a lot of thumbs down going around here. So yes, I think we are on the same wavelength, because if you look at our health outcomes, with longevity being one of the most important of those health outcomes, we are at the absolute bottom. So we spend the most amount of money compared to people who are kind of our reference countries, but our health outcomes are actually some of the worst, so much so that our life expectancy is 3 years lower than the average for our reference countries. And this has been going on for a while, actually. It's not just since the COVID pandemic. We actually had life expectancy in the United States going up for most of the 20th century, but then it started to stabilize, kind of level off, and then actually we started to have an increase in mortality and a decrease in longevity starting about in 2014. So that was even before the COVID pandemic. And interestingly, and something that we can actually make a difference on, hopefully, is that the reason our life expectancy is going down in the United States is because there's been an increase in mortality from causes like drug overdoses, suicides, but then also organ system diseases, so things like heart disease or diabetes, among young and middle-aged adults. So a lot of our population isn't even making it to the old age that we are all hoping to reach because of these things that are going on in our health and in our society. And if you look at the top 10 causes of mortality, the top 10 things that kill us in the United States, I have the list up here: heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, all those things. The ones that I have in red are the ones that are directly affected by our lifestyle choices. So those are the ones, besides others that are not in the top 10, but those are the ones that we can have the biggest impact on. And really, when you look at 8 out of 10, there's a lot of room that we could make a big difference. And you know, we call the things that kill us those names. We call them like heart disease, we call it stroke, we call it cancer. But what's the underlying cause? Like, what is the actual thing that's creating the risk? This is a study that looked at the Global Burden of Disease study and also the state of US health. And when you look at what is the #1 risk for disease and disability, it's not tobacco anymore, though tobacco is still up there, it's #2, but it's actually the food that we eat. It's dietary risks. So when you look at the things that are causing, the kind of upstream things that are causing the problems of heart disease, diabetes, cancer, it's things like our diet. And then there's some other risk factors that are up there. Obviously, tobacco is still a big one, but also things like having high blood pressure or having high blood sugar, having high cholesterol, problems with our kidney function, not having enough physical activity. So when you look at the majority of the causes of the things that end up ending our lives earlier than we would want, a lot of them are things that we have some capacity to control or at least improve. All right, so what about genetics? Here's another one. We'll do a little bit of audience participation again. Everybody put your hand out, same thing, put out that fist, little tactile kinesthetic learning, good. All right, if you think that DNA is your destiny and your genetics control what happened to you, do thumbs up. If you say, nope, we have a lot of control over what happens to us, the DNA is not our destiny, thumbs down. And if you're like, I don't know, that's complicated, go ahead and put it in the middle. So what do you guys think? Thumbs up, thumbs down? I see some thumbs down, I see some in the middle. Okay, cool. I don't see too many thumbs up, a little bit that DNA controls our destiny. Well, it turns out with twin experiments, we've been able to see that our DNA is only about 1/3 of the impact on how long we live and what sort of diseases we might get. Now, absolutely true, some things about our DNA are pretty much, if you have it, you're gonna have the thing. For example, if you have the DNA, the genes for blue eyes, you're gonna have blue eyes. It doesn't matter how much broccoli you eat or how much physical activity you do, you're gonna end up with blue eyes. However, a lot of the things that are genes that have effects on our health, as far as heart disease or cancer or diabetes, those genes actually are very much affected by our lifestyle and the sort of things that we're exposed to. So just because you might have a gene that predisposes you to high blood pressure, depending on the way that you live your life, the food you eat, the physical activity that you do, you may never have high blood pressure. So genes and DNA are not our destiny. They do have an impact, without a doubt, but there's a lot of things that we can do to sort of alter or modify that impact. So like we like to say in the lifestyle medicine world, genetics load the gun, but it's lifestyle that pulls the trigger. And that's what lifestyle medicine is all about. So we look at 6 different pillars of lifestyle medicine, and they have to do with what we eat, a predominantly plant-forward diet. They also have to do with how much physical activity we do, and how much do we prioritize restorative sleep. Are we avoiding risky substances? Are we paying attention and nurturing our social connections? And then also, how are we doing with stress management? What are some of our healthy stress management strategies? Luckily, there are places in the world that are still doing really well with longevity and vitality. These are places called the blue zones. Has anybody ever heard of blue zones? Raise your hand if you've heard of blue zones. I see a couple. All right, cool. So the blue zones are places in the world that have uncommonly long longevity. So much so that in some of these places, there are 10 times the number of centenarians per population than we have here in the United States. And if you take a look at this map, a lot of these places do not have like really advanced healthcare systems, or they're not necessarily a high socioeconomic country or area. But if you look at where the blue zones are located, there's one in Okinawa, which is where the world's oldest women live. There's one in Sardinia, Italy, which is where the world's oldest men can be found. There's also one in Greece called the island of Ikaria, which is also known as the island where they forget to die. So if anybody's looking for a good vacation spot, I would definitely recommend Ikaria. There's Nicoya, Costa Rica, and then we do actually have one blue zone here in the United States, and it's in Loma Linda, California. But it's not the whole town of Loma Linda, California. It's actually just the Seventh-day Adventist community in Loma Linda, where it is incredibly common to live into your 80s, 90s, and over 100s, still living independently, still doing all the things that makes your life feel like you have purpose. So, believe it or not, the people who make it to be centenarians are actually aging slower. Their biological age can be about 8.5 years younger than their chronological age. And we know that by looking at their DNA, like we talked about before, the epigenetic markers, that these methylation things that give us an idea of what genes are being turned on, what genes are being turned off. For people that hit that centenarian and above, they are actually aging slower than their chronological age would suggest. So let's take a look at what that might mean in some place in the United States so that we can kind of compare apples to apples. Like where we are here in the United States is different than what might be happening in Okinawa or what might be happening in Ikaria. But if you look at the number of years of life expectancy, and you look at, this was data that happened before the COVID pandemic, but at that point, overall for the United States, the purple bar that you see, for women, the average age of life expectancy was 81.2 years, and for guys it was 76.5. Now here in Pennsylvania, we are the yellow bar, and I'm sorry to say just living in Pennsylvania seems to decrease your life expectancy, so we were a little bit below the United States average. And the blue bar is New Jersey, which is a little bit higher. So, you know, anybody thinking about moving to New Jersey, there's maybe some good longevity reasons to do so. And then the red bar is California, which is where Loma Linda is. So if we really want to compare, you know, kind of apples to apples like we were saying, let's look at the people in California compared to the Seventh-day Adventist community in California. And what we see is that with the two green bars for both men and women, just being an Adventist in general, has a healthier life expectancy because that faith community really focuses on things like physical activity, avoidance of risky substances. They have a great social connection as being part of that community. But if you then additionally add on the Adventists who self-identify as vegetarian, so they're eating more whole plant foods, you find that women get an extra 8 years of healthy life expectancy compared to the American average. And men, it's more like 11 extra years. So that's not just 11 years of life, but 11 years of healthy life just by being a part of all those social nudges that the Adventist community kind of pushes people to do on a daily basis. So we know that the lifestyle choices that we make can have a huge impact on how long and how well we live. So in most of the blue zones, this is the type of food that they're eating. They're having a whole lot of really colorful fruits and vegetables, whole grains, beans, nuts and seeds, less ultra-processed foods, less animal-based foods. Now, I'm not saying that we all have to go completely off of all animal-based foods because that doesn't seem to be, first of all, necessary, and it's also not the way a lot of people would like to have their kind of culinary cuisine. But in the blue zones, people have maybe 90% of their diet, or the food that they're eating, is more whole plant foods, not processed, or at least not the ultra-processed stuff that we often see. And also, they have like less sugar-sweetened beverages. Pretty much they don't have it at all. They might still have about 10% of their calories coming from animal products, but that's a smaller amount. They use it more for special occasion foods or for kind of flavorings like a condiment. Unfortunately, here in the United States, we kind of turn that nutritional wisdom on its head. You know, we start off as kids with some version of junk food, and then as we get a little older, it's just a different version of junk food as far as the pub food and things like that. Along the way, there's lots of ice cream, lots of pizza, which for those of you who know me is my own personal kryptonite. I love pizza, so you know, it's definitely one of those things that when it's around, it's hard to not eat. More of the sugar-sweetened beverages, we have that pretty much ubiquitously everywhere. And then the evil cookies that you will find at the nurse's station or at your friend's house or just out and about because they're always there. So with that type of food environment, we end up having about 2/3 of our food that we eat as Americans is just kind of ultra-processed, refined junk food. That's what the yellow portion of the pie graph is. Another 25% would be things like animal foods or animal products of our foods. And then only about 12% would be considered plant food. Only half of that would be considered coming from whole plants because some of what they considered plant food was like the apple in apple pie or something like that. So what you see is that we have really flipped what the blue zone's eating pattern is into something where we're doing the exact opposite of that. Now, the good news is we can make a shift. And this is some data from the Global Burden of Disease study that looked at if people switch to an optimal diet, and by that they said a higher intake of whole grains, beans, fish, fruit, vegetables, and nuts, and then a decreased intake of red and processed meats, so deli meats, sugar-sweetened beverages, and refined grains versus a typical Western diet. And this wasn't just, kind of looking at Americans. It was looking globally. If you went to shifted to an optimal diet from what is considered a Western diet, if you did that at age 20, women could gain over 10 years of healthy life expectancy, and men actually 13. Now, if you waited till age 60, which I would not recommend, but if you did, you could still end up with over 8 years of increased healthy life expectancy. And what really shocked me as a physician was that even waiting till age 80, if you switch then, you could still get over 3 years of additional healthy life expectancy. So there's a huge impact on our eating pattern on how long that we live. Now, if you really want to just kind of get the biggest bang for your buck, what are the things that you should focus on? And they found that you get the longest, or the largest, I guess you should say, the largest longevity gains by eating more beans, love our beans, eating more whole grains and nuts, and then decreasing red meat and processed meats. Those are the places that you can make the biggest bang for your buck. So this is great news, right? We got a whole lot of things to choose from, things that we could eat that will help with longevity. How well are we doing with this type of a eating pattern here in the United States? Well, when you look at data from NHANES studies, looks like not so great. From 2001 to 2018, the proportion of older adults with poor diet quality increased from 51% to 61%. Again, this was even before the pandemic. The proportion of older adults with an intermediate diet, so kind of like so-so, decreased from 49% to 39%. So pretty much all of them went to the poor diet in a way. And the proportion of older adults who have an ideal diet quality is very consistently and disappointingly low at 0.4%. So this is a area that even small shifts could make a big difference. Okay, so let's get into chronic disease. What is the underlying cause of most chronic disease? Does anybody have a guess? What do you guys think? Anybody want to shout it out? Like, what's the underlying cause of most of the chronic disease in the well, everywhere really, not just in the United States? Any guesses? Thinking, percolating, a little bit. Poor diet, yep. And what happens to us in our bodies that causes disease? Yes, I heard it, inflammation, woohoo, good job in the back. So yes, inflammation seems to be the underlying cause. Now, I went to medical school in the last century. I graduated from medical school in the 90s, and we did not necessarily know at that time how much of an impact inflammation was having. But it seems to be the common underlying cause for heart disease, for diabetes, for dementia, for stroke, for cancer. And when I say inflammation, I mean chronic inflammation. Because acute inflammation is good. You know, like you get a cut and you maybe get a little bit of bacteria in there. You get acute inflammation, your immune system revs up, it comes and starts, cleaning everything up, and then it shuts down. That's good. That's what we want. But chronic inflammation is like a slow, low-burning fire that never really shuts off. It's always got this oxidative stress going on in your body. And even though you don't have a specific infection or something, it's always going on. And that is very damaging. So a lot of the things that we've been talking about as far as lifestyle habits or things that we could do to live a healthier life, some of the things that we are maybe not optimizing at this point cause inflammation in our body. And so that's going to be a theme that runs through the rest of what we talk about here. But let's start with our food. And I promise we are not just talking about food today, we're just starting with food, and then we'll get into physical activity and all these other things. But a lot of the things that we eat can cause inflammation. First of all, just having excess calories. We need to have some fat on our bodies. We don't want to be completely without it, but if we have excess or extra adipose tissue, fat tissue, that actually releases pro-inflammatory compounds. So just too many calories of anything, even if it was carrots, could end up causing inflammation. But then refined carbohydrates are a big one. So things like sugar-sweetened beverages, white bread, white rice, refined pasta, all that stuff. I had a good friend and colleague, Dr. Hans Diehl, who in the lifestyle medicine movement, who used to say, the whiter the bread, the sooner you're dead. And that's one way to kind of think about that. We would do much better with the fiber-rich and the whole grains. Then having an imbalance between the omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. We get a lot of our omega-6s from processed oils, corn oil, safflower oil. Trans fat, which luckily we don't have as much of in our food supply anymore, but that's very inflammatory. And then saturated fat. So saturated fat comes from things like meat, dairy, processed junk food. So I'm curious if anybody knows, what is the largest food source, or what food source gives us the most amount of saturated fat in the American diet? Any guesses? Cheese, I heard it. Yes, it's cheese. So cheese is actually the thing. Now, of course, there's bacon, there's sausage, there's meat, there's all that. But if you look at a per capita basis, cheese is what is giving us the most saturated fat in our diet. Okay, and then animal protein itself can be, especially things like processed red meat, deli meats, bacon, sausage, those can also be very inflammatory. And so when you look at the United States and what we eat, we're eating a lot of sugar. We're getting about 30 teaspoons or more of extra added sugar a day. We eat a lot of meat. Actually, it is up to 222 pounds of meat per person per year. So again, significantly more than what you would find in the blue zones. And like I said, my own personal kryptonite, cheese. I love cheese, but we're apparently eating 40 pounds of it per person per year in the United States. So that is a lot of inflammatory type foods. And you guys can tell I really like Albert Einstein. So he had this quote as well, which said, sometimes the easiest way to solve a problem is to stop participating in the problem. And that's relevant for lots of different problems, but when we look at the inflammation that's being caused by some of the food that we're eating, that's some good advice. Now, luckily, there are also things that we can eat that are anti-inflammatory, things that can decrease inflammation. So one of the ways to do that is by eating the rainbow of different colors of fruits and vegetables, because all those different colors have different phytonutrients and antioxidants and things that are just, ready to calm down the inflammation in the diet. Also, choosing fiber-rich whole grains instead of the refined grains. Fiber is awesome. Fiber is our friend. Swapping out some of the animal-based proteins for plant-based proteins. Doesn't have to be everything, but plant-based proteins are anti-inflammatory, and so that's a great one to do. And then swapping out the animal-based and processed fats with whole plant fat sources. So instead of the butter, the lard, the Crisco, doing the olive oil, the avocado, the nuts. That's going to be a healthier and less inflammatory type of food. And then spices. You got to use your spices, because spices are the best antioxidant punch in a very, very small container, basically, or small amount, and they make food taste delicious. So those are great ways to reduce inflammation with what you eat. So we want to eat that type of rainbow, right? Not that type of rainbow. Because vegan does not mean healthy. It's one of those things that we think like, oh, vegan, that must be good for us. Soda, potato chips, even Oreo cookies can be vegan. And so I like to think about more whole food, plant predominant. What are you eating? Whereas vegan just says what you aren't eating, says you're not eating animal products. And there's reasons for that. Some people are doing it for ethical reasons, for sustainability of the planet reasons. There's all sorts of different reasons. But from a health standpoint, switching from whatever the standard American diet is to a vegan diet that's very processed and has lots of added fats and sugar and salt is really not going to get you much of a benefit. So we want to go towards, instead, the whole food, plant predominant way, because that's where we get our fiber. A lot of the vegan foods that I showed you up there, right there, they've stripped out most of the fiber. So does anybody know, where does fiber come from? What type of food does fiber come from? What? Beans, yeah, beans, plants, exactly. Fiber comes from plants. There's no fiber in animal products at all. Like, fiber is basically like how we as humans, we've got bones that hold us up. That's like gives us structure. Plants have fiber. That's what is like their skeleton. So the only place that you can get fiber is from plants. And for men, the goal is to get at least 38 grams a day. Women need at least 25 grams a day, but I would recommend more like 40 grams a day for all of us. You just have to work your way up to it. You don't want to go from like 5 to 40 all at once. That'll be very uncomfortable. But if we increase fiber, it's associated with a decreased risk of heart disease, stroke, and high blood pressure. So much so that each 10-gram increase in the daily fiber intake that you have in food, not necessarily a fiber supplement, but in food, results in a 10% decreased risk of all-cause mortality. I mean, that's dying of everything. So, 10 grams of fiber, that's like 3/4 of a cup of beans. It's not that much, it's not that hard to get fiber in, but you need to have whole plant foods to do so. So, knowing that we want to get up, it'd be great if we could get up to 40. What do you think is the average American daily intake of fiber? Anybody have any guesses in grams? 2. I've made you guys like so pessimistic. a little bit more than 2. Close, yeah, 15 actually, so close. So 15 grams, which as a doctor makes me go, no wonder we are a nation of constipation and diverticulosis, because we are just not getting anywhere near enough fiber, because that's very sad. And fiber is also really good for our gut microbiome. So the gut microbiome, if we give it fiber, it produces these short-chain fatty acids that are anti-inflammatory. So again, can help decrease the inflammation in our body. And those also then modulate those metabolic pathways that we've been talking about that actually impact obesity, glucose metabolism, stuff like that. Also, if you've got a healthy microbiome, that suppresses the nasties, the type of bacteria and parasites and viruses you don't want in there. In the same way that if you have a wildflower meadow, it's hard for weeds to take hold because there's not a whole lot of space for them. But if you completely like rip up all the wildflowers and all the stuff in the meadow, then weeds can come back. Same thing is what happens in our gut. So we want to have the healthy gut microbiome. helps us digest our food, which is good, supports our immune system. But what's really interesting is how much a healthy gut microbiome impacts our mood. Because the bacteria in our gut actually release hormones like serotonin and dopamine. The things that we think about as far as for depression and anxiety and the reward pathways, we get a lot of that from the bacteria in our guts if we have healthy bacteria. Dysbiosis, which is when you don't have healthy bacteria, puts us in the opposite direction as far as our mood. And diversity of what we eat and diversity of what's going on in our gut is really important, because you can increase when we look at a healthy gut microbiome, the most important thing is diversity of species. Like, you don't want to just have 2 or 3 of them in there. You want a bunch of different ones because they each do different things. So if you eat a wide variety of food, you'll get, especially some that's fermented, so like a wide variety of different types of plant foods, some fermented, but as much whole food as possible, you'll get a lot wider, or better, I guess you would say, gut microbiome. So much so that if people who have eaten at least 30 different types of plants throughout the week, like that's kind of their norm because they eat a lot of different food, they actually have been found to have a greater variety of microbes in their gut. So diversity, don't just go on the like grapefruit diet. You want to have lots and lots of different types of plants, and that'll help your gut microbiome. Okay. Now, when we look at things like what happens with inflammation or heart disease or risk of all-cause mortality, when you look at plant protein versus animal protein, because we all need protein for sure, but if you take just 3% of calories from animal protein and you swap that out with an equivalent amount of plant protein, you get an 11 or 12%, depending on if you're a man or woman, decrease in your cardiovascular disease mortality risk. So 3% is not that much. I know we were hearing beans here a lot. That's one of my go-tos for swapping out animal protein for some bean protein, because just a small amount can make a huge difference. And then there's salt. Unfortunately, there is salt in almost everything in the American diet, especially the takeout stuff, stuff that you buy in bags and bottles and boxes, but also the stuff that you get at a restaurant or a fast food sort of establishment. And excess salt is associated with cardiovascular disease, stroke, hypertension, all that stuff. So the goal is to try to get, if you're an adult that's greater than or age 50, like I am, or somebody who has already got hypertension or heart disease or kidney disease, you want to have less than 1,500 milligrams of sodium a day. And that's about 2/3 of a teaspoon. I should have brought the little bag to show you like how little that is. For younger adults, the goal is less than 2,300 milligrams a day, which is a teaspoon. But if you look overall, most Americans are eating between 3,000 to 4,000 milligrams of sodium a day. And that's a huge amount of strain on our cardiovascular system. So the best thing to try to shift to is, as much as possible, our whole foods plant predominant diet. And that would include all of these things that we have up here. But so that you remember it, we're going to sing the song that we sing with elementary school kids, because for Kellen Foundation, we go out into the elementary schools and we teach about healthy lifestyles. And rather than try to get kids to remember all these things, we have a song. So raise your hand if you know the bingo song. Anybody know the B-I-N-G-O? All right, cool. So I'm going to sing it for you once, what the healthy fruits and vegetables song is, and then we can all do it together. So this is how it goes for starters. It goes like this. It goes, fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds, and whole grains too. And beans, because you got to do the jazz hands. There we go. Thank you. All right, so everybody together so we remember the stuff that's good for our inflammation, good for our gut microbiome. Here we go. Ready? Fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds, and whole grains too. And beans. Yay, good job, guys. Now you'll be driving home and you'll have that earworm going on. That's good. All right. So we've been talking about the benefits of plant-based diets, and it's basically helps us improve all the things that we don't want to have. Lower risk of dying, cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, all sorts of stuff. So try to find the places in your life where you can easily access some of those whole food plant predominant type of meals. This is our chef Amanda for Kellen Foundation. So this is part of what she's kind of dedicated her life to, is making whole food plant-based delicious. But doing it yourself at home, batch cooking, doing potlucks together, ways to make it easier to eat this type of food. Okay, so now moving on to other lifestyle things and how that impacts our longevity and our happiness. Physical activity is a huge one. So I always love this quote from the Earl of Derby, which says, "Those who do not find time for exercise will have to find time for illness." And unfortunately, that's probably the truth. So if we want to get enough physical activity to support our health, what are our goals? And these are the adult physical activity goals from the National Physical Activity Plan. The goal is to get between 150 and 300 minutes of moderate physical activity a week, or 75 minutes of vigorous, and that's the aerobic stuff, and we'll be talking about how do you know whether it's moderate or vigorous. But then don't forget the strength and resistance training, because that is a huge, huge impact on longevity. The goal is to try to do that with all the major muscle groups, at least twice a week. And if you're older than age 65, I would say we should all be doing this. But the specific recommendation is if you're 65 and older, you should also be doing things that require balance, like neuromotor activities, like yoga, dancing, tai chi, standing on one foot while you're brushing your teeth, anything to kind of keep those balance proprioceptors going. Because one of the biggest risk factors for older adults is if they fall and they break something. Because if you break your hip, it is not very likely, unfortunately, that you will end up being able to go back to the type of lifestyle that you had before, living independently and things like that. So if you're trying to figure out, how do I know whether the activity I'm doing, whether it's mild, moderate, or vigorous, you can do the talk-sing test. So has anybody ever heard of the talk-sing test? Anybody? Got a couple people here? Cool, awesome. Yeah, I love it in the back. So the talk-sing test is like this. If you go out and you're going for a walk with a friend and you're able to have a complete conversation, talk in full sentences, and you could also sing a chorus of a song, that's light activity, which is great. I mean, it's better than being sedentary, so all activity counts. But if you want to get up to moderate, that would be pushing yourself a little bit more so that you are able to still speak in complete sentences, but you would not be able to sing. You wouldn't be able to sing a chorus of a song. That's moderate. And then if we're talking vigorous, that means that you're pushing yourself so much that you wouldn't be able to sing, but you also wouldn't be able to complete a full sentence without needing to take a breath. So that's the way you can say, like when you're out, going for a hike with friends, or if you're biking or something, how can you tell? Do the talk-sing test, and you'll be able to say, are you light, moderate, or vigorous? There's also this stuff called the metabolic equivalent of task. I am not going to get too into this, but it's a research way of doing things and saying, basically it tells you how much energy are you using for any specific activity. One MET is kind of what you guys are doing now, the amount of energy that you use when you're just sitting. So I'm just putting it up there so that as we talk about METs and MET minutes, you'll see it's just a way of measuring it for research studies. And when we look at how much benefit you get for physical activity, it's really kind of mind-blowing, at least for a doctor, when we look at the difference between physical activity and a lot of the other stuff we can do like pills and procedures. So what this study looked at is it said, okay, if people were doing less than 500 MET minutes per week, which is less than the physical activity guidelines, so just think of it that way. They weren't meeting the aerobic physical activity guidelines, but they weren't sedentary. They were doing something. They had a 22% reduction in their risk of dying, so reduction in all-cause mortality. The 500 to 999 MET minutes is people who are meeting those physical activity guidelines that I talked to you about. They cut their risk of dying by 28%. And for the people that were exceeding the physical activity guidelines, they actually reduced their risk of dying by 1/3, which is, if this was a drug, like if I had a drug that I could reduce people's risk of dying by 1/3, I would be giving it to all of you. I would be taking it myself. But these are the types of things that we can get as far as physical activity, the types of outcomes. However, some exercise is always better than none. So this study looked at how much benefit do you get as far as decreased risk of all-cause mortality, decreased risk of dying of anything, with the amount of exercise you do. So for people who went from sedentary, doing pretty much not anything, to just doing 50 minutes a week of moderate to vigorous, so just maybe 10 minutes a day, 5 days a week, they cut their risk of dying by 20%. And that was the steepest slope of the curve. So you get the biggest bang for your buck going from doing nothing to doing something. And then after that, as they increased the amount of exercise that they were doing, they got additional benefit, which is great. And eventually you get to a point where it kind of plateaus. You can do more physical activity if you're training for something, or you feel like it makes you feel good, it's good for your mood, but you get to a point where it doesn't necessarily decrease your risk of mortality. However, when you think about just getting up and doing something for 10 minutes a day, that gives you a huge return on your investment. And like I said before, don't forget about the resistance training. That's really important too. So resistance training gives you benefit independent of the aerobic activity. So you want to do both aerobic and resistance training. The best kind of sweet spot as far as decreased risk of mortality is doing your resistance training at least twice a week and doing all those major muscle groups a total of an hour. So 30 minutes twice a week will get you to that sweet spot. And we know that lean muscle mass is a huge predictor of longevity. So when they looked at older adults and they broke people up into quartiles, they found that the people who had the most lean body mass, the ones who had the most muscle, that they had a 20% decreased risk of dying compared to those who were in the lowest quartile. So a lot of times as we get older, we don't think about doing strength training. It is critical for our ability to continue to do our activity of daily living, but also for our longevity. So how about steps? How many steps should we do to try to take advantage of our decreased risk of mortality? And I really appreciate that some of our people in the back here already know the answer to this. That's right. Thank you, Dick. But if you look at people who have less than 4,000 steps a day and you think of them as the sedentary group, when you compare for people who have less than 4,000 steps a day, if you can get up to at least 8,000 or more steps a day, that cuts your risk of dying by 51%. Pretty good, right? Now, if you can get above 12,000 steps a day, cuts your risk of dying by 2/3. So when we look at talking to ourselves, our families, our patients, people that are participating in our programs, a couple of little factoids, little counseling factoids start to come to mind. And it's things like, you get the biggest bang for your buck just getting up and doing 10 minutes of physical activity a day. And then once you get that going, maybe you want to increase it. But you don't have to go to the gym and spend an hour there to get some benefit. Or if we're talking about the steps, just getting up to a little bit more than 4,000 steps a day is going to help. And if you can get above 8,000, you've already cut your risk of dying in half. So we know that physical activity helps with all sorts of chronic disease, but especially things like depression and anxiety, dementia, something that's very difficult to treat, but helps to prevent. And then, of course, things like diabetes and heart disease and cancer. So when we look at it specifically, physical activity and the effect on depression, there's been a bunch of studies that show that it is actually comparable to psychotherapy and to pharmacotherapy. So people who already have depression, mild to moderate depression, if they get engaged in a physical activity program, and there's lots of different options. Walking seems to work, running is great, yoga, strength training, dancing, all of those showed significant effects, so much so that they were equivalent to pharmacotherapy or psychotherapy. Now I say do both, get as much benefit as possible, but if you're not talking to people who have depression about increasing their physical activity, you're leaving a really, really important tool back in your toolkit and not being able to utilize it. Higher intensity physical activity is more effective, but we all know we got to build up to that. You can't send somebody right out to run a marathon. And physical activity out in nature is also really, really helpful. Actually, just being out in nature in general is wonderful for mental health, but it's also good for our immune system. So they've looked at when people are spending time out in nature, they found that they have decreased cortisol in their saliva and in their blood serum. They also have an increased number of the natural killer cells, which is part of what goes around in our immune system and fights off cancer or finds the infections, and improved mood. So we didn't have enough time today to get all into forest bathing, but I would recommend you check it out because just being outside in a natural setting can really improve mood and improve health. It also decreases our perceptions of pain, so much so that a post-op study that was done actually just down in one of the hospitals outside of Philly showed that post-op patients who were randomized to go to a room where they had a window that looked out onto some type of nature, it was like the trees and the grass, versus the ones that were randomized to go into a room that just looked out on a brick wall, the ones that could see nature had less need for pain control and were discharged earlier than the ones who were just looking out on a brick wall. So whatever we can do to get outside is going to be helpful. All right, now we're moving on to sleep. These are my twin grandbabies. They are 6 months old today. So I often think about sleep and them, and I think, what do you guys think? Is it good to sleep like a baby? I know, some people are like, yeah, other people are like, no. I would say no after being and hanging with these guys recently. You know, babies sleep terribly. They sleep a lot, but they like get up and down, up and down. What we really want to do is sleep like a teenager. Teenagers go to bed, they fall asleep, they're almost impossible to wake up, you know, when it's time to do stuff. But all kidding aside, sleep is very, very, very important for all of us. And this quote actually comes from Matthew Walker, who has a great book called Why We Sleep. And I'm curious, if you heard this pitch on late night TV, would you be interested in buying what they're selling, which is amazing breakthrough. Scientists have discovered a revolutionary new treatment that makes you live longer. It enhances your memory, makes you more creative, makes you look more attractive. It keeps you slim and lowers food cravings, protects you from cancer and dementia, wards off colds and the flu, lowers your risk of heart attacks and stroke, not to mention diabetes, and you'll even feel happier, less depressed, and less anxious. Are you interested? Like, yeah, I want that type of thing too. But it turns out all of those things come from getting enough restorative, rejuvenating sleep. So how much sleep do we need? Adults need between 7 to 9 hours a day, maybe 7 to 8, 7 to 9. Kiddos need more than that, and our teenagers especially are ones that are not getting enough because they still need between 8.5 and 9.5 hours a day. And really, like, why do we sleep? It kind of looks like you're just lying there not doing anything, but truly a lot of metabolic stuff is going on while we are sleeping. It helps us process our memories and our learning for the day. It helps with our immune system. It really helps with physical recovery. That's part of the first half of the night of sleep, and it regulates our metabolism. So much so that if we're not getting enough sleep, we get all these negative consequences, like increased sympathetic mediators, so your fight or flight system is jacked up. You also have increased cortisol, which is one of those things that can cause inflammation and can also cause weight gain. Decreases in leptin, which is the hormone that makes you feel full. But you get an increase in ghrelin, which is the hormone that makes you feel hungry. So it's this double whammy going on where if you don't get enough sleep, you're craving things, often things that are high in carbohydrate, like refined carbohydrates and fats, and you're getting more cortisol going on. Decreases your growth hormone, and it also impairs glucose tolerance and sets people up for prediabetes. They did this study at the University of Chicago taking healthy young college students who I think are probably the only people who would volunteer for a study like this. But what they did is they said, okay, come into our sleep lab, and for 3 nights, we'll hook you up to the sleep monitor, and when you start to fall into deep sleep, somebody's gonna go in and wake you up and be like, hey, wake up. So for 3 nights in a row, they didn't get deep restorative sleep because they were woken up. And what they found is in just 3 nights, they actually had a decrease in their insulin sensitivity by 25%, which is about what you would see gaining 20 to 30 pounds. And these were young, healthy people, 3 nights. So they were already tipping over into what might be considered pre-diabetes just by not getting enough sleep. And there is now a just plethora of studies and meta-analyses and things looking at where is the sweet spot for sleep. And it looks to be at about 7 hours. And that's 7 hours of actually sleeping, not necessarily 7 hours in bed, but 7 hours of actually sleeping. That's the lowest risk of all-cause mortality, total cardiovascular disease, heart disease, and stroke is right around in there. Where we really start to see the problem is less than 6 hours of sleep a night and greater than 9 hours of sleep a night. Now, not many people get greater than 9 hours of sleep a night unless they maybe have some other thing going on with their health or with their life that is causing that to be. So, but less than 6, a lot of us do. And this change, as far as like we saw the University of Chicago study with the kids, this also happens with adults, and it happens quickly. Well, they were adults too, but they were young adults. They were in college, right? So they did a study where they took 26 healthy adults, and for 1 week, they made them sleep less than 6 hours a night. They kept them from sleeping. And then the other week, they let them sleep as long as they wanted to, and they ended up averaging about 8.5 hours of sleep during that week. But what they did that was intriguing about this is that they took blood to look at their transcriptome, which is what's going on with their DNA, what genes are turned on, what genes are turned off, and they used them as their own controls, seeing when they were sleep deprived versus when they were well rested. And they found that just 1 week of sleep deprivation altered the function of 711 genes. That's a massive change going on inside that we don't even know about, right? And a lot of those genes had to do with circadian rhythm, metabolism, inflammation, immunity, and oxidative stress. So all those things that feed back into those top 10 things that kill us that we've been talking about earlier. All right, so that's sleep. Now let's talk about stress. And I love this quote as well, which says, "Peace does not mean to be in a place where there's no noise, trouble, or hard work, but it means to be in the midst of those things and still be calm in your heart." Because I think it's unlikely any of us are really going to live a life of no stress. That's probably not going to happen. But some amount of stress actually is good for us. It kind of gets us up out of bed in the morning, gets us to accomplish things, try new stuff. But the problem is when you get to the point where the stress is overwhelming and you feel like you can't possibly succeed or you can't possibly handle it. And when we get to that level of stress, then our fight or flight response is jacked up again, very similar to when we don't get enough sleep. And that increases our sympathetic mediators, our adrenaline, our norepinephrine. It decreases our parasympathetic mediators, which are the things that are the rest and digest and recover sort of hormones. And we got to be in balance with that. It also suppresses our immune system. So when we're very, very stressed, we're more likely to get sick. We're more likely to get cancer. It also increases our cortisol. So as you can see, sleep deprivation and overwhelming stress have some very similar metabolic consequences. So when we have increased cortisol, that increases, like we said before, gaining weight, holding on to weight, and increases our appetite. It makes us crave things that are maybe not our healthiest choices. When people are under chronic stress, that increases their risk of depression and anxiety for sure, but also heart disease. It accelerates progression of other infectious diseases, increases your risk of diabetes, and it jacks up those inflammatory mediators that cause havoc kind of throughout the whole body. But luckily, this is one aspect of these different lifestyle pillars that we're talking about where there's really good data that shows that you can flip this switch. You can change this with mind-body techniques. And when we talk about mind-body techniques, it's critical that people are doing ones that they like to do. So we'll get to that in a minute, but in a way, I can tell you how much physical activity would be optimal or would be good to strive for most of us. I can tell you what type of a diet would be, pretty healthy for most of us. When we're talking about mind-body techniques, what works for me may not work for you. So it's really important for people to kind of have the permission and explore what is it that they would like to do as opposed to what they have to do. But if they find that, it could be meditation, it could be yoga, it could be Tai Chi, could be journaling, all sorts of different things. But people, when they're involved in that increases their vagal tone, which is that rest, digest, recover, and it decreases the sympathetic mediators, that fight or flight. So it flips the switch on what's going on metabolically. It helps with their blood pressure, with their heart rate variability, decreases their cortisol, decreases other inflammatory mediators, and it also helps improve coping strategies. So when people are having a regular meditation or other mind-body practice, they are able to often take in something that's happening that's stressful and shift from feeling that as threat to feeling that is a challenge. And that makes a huge difference in how we react as a metabolic, species or being, is if we feel under threat, a whole bunch of cascading of things happen. Whereas if we feel like something's a challenge, a whole different type of cascade happens that's a much healthier and more enjoyable and less inflammatory type of cascade. So like we said, there's a ton of different stress management techniques. It's the most important thing is for people to find time, like schedule time to do the things that you want to do, not just the things that you have to do. Because this is just as important as making sure that you're, going out and getting a walk. A walk could be your stress management mind-body technique. That'd be good. All right. So let's start wrapping up with some of the other things, other pillars. Social connection is key. And as I said in the beginning, we kind of have an epidemic now of loneliness and isolation in our country, so much so that Surgeon General Vivek Murthy has called it out as like a public health crisis. So we often say, like, when I have time, I'll get in touch with that friend I haven't talked with in a while, or when I have time, I'll get together with my family. But it is really critically important, so much so that the Harvard study of adult development, which is the longest study of adults and happiness and longevity going on like in the world, showed that the quality of our relationships is more important than wealth, status, or power in determining how long you live and how happy you are. So we often think about putting kind of deposits into our bank account for retirement, saying financial deposits, we want to put that in there. That's important, but if we're not putting the same type of deposits into our social connections, we're going to have a less likely being a happy, healthy, long-living person. And loneliness is a modifiable risk factor. It's something that we can do something about. This study that looked at older adults found that they basically were asked 3 questions. They said, do you feel left out? Do you feel isolated? Do you have lack of companionship? And if people said yes to any one of those 3, they were classified as lonely. And they followed them over the course of the study and found that the people who were in the lonely category were 60% more likely to die during that 8-year time frame. So this is relatively easy things to ask people, 3 little questions. But if somebody says yes, this is a serious risk factor to be addressed in the same way that if their blood pressure is too high, we should be addressing. So I'll give you an example of the power of social connection. How many of you guys know where Roseto, Pennsylvania is? Anybody? Some of us? Cool. All right. Roseto was and still is, a very cool place, but it was a very intriguing place back in about the 1930s to the 1960s, where for some strange reason it was realized they had a whole lot less heart disease and cardiovascular mortality compared to the towns around them, like Bangor and Nazareth. So they started to kind of get studied to be like, what's going on with that? So this is Roseto. It has their church, Our Lady of Mount Carmel. They were very commonly having large families that all of the people, or the majority of them, lived into their 80s, 90s, or 100. This gentleman here, Carmen, actually, that's his 100th birthday, but he lived until just before he turned 104, which was not atypical amongst not just his family, but a lot of the families living in Roseto. And what they found when researchers studied this was, well, it is a close-knit Italian-American community that was very commonly having 3-generation households. It was very family-centered as far as their social life, very community-centered, had a very strong religious connection, and it was like a matter of pride to volunteer for the fire company or to support your local businesses, to know your neighbors, to be a part of the community. Very civic-minded, very strong social cohesion. So that's the positive social stuff going on in Roseto, but they were also doing a lot of things that are the same risk factors that were happening in Bangor and Nazareth and Penargil and all the other places around in the valley. They were drinking quite a bit of their own homemade red wine. They were smoking quite a bit. Cigars were very common. Food was often prepared with lard, and we just talked about earlier how that's not usually a good thing for your heart. They also enjoyed a lot of sweet desserts, but they had this great social connection of feeling like people had their back, feeling like they belonged. And if you look at what happened with their cardiovascular disease mortality rates, when you look in the 1930s and the 1940s, 1950s, and about halfway through into the 1960s, they had 30 to 40% decreased risk of dying of heart disease compared to Bangor and Nazareth, who had similar risk factors, similar access to physicians, pretty similar, like living here in the Lehigh Valley. But then something happened in the 60s and ongoing, where all of a sudden Roseto had the same type of heart disease mortality that everybody else in the valley did. And that is when things changed in the social makeup of Roseto, because the close-knit family cohesion and supportive community structure kind of evaporated. That generation of Rosetans decided, to move out and to kind of live a different lifestyle, not stay in Roseto like the rest of their family had for generations. And when that kind of social support was gone, the cardioprotective environment also disappeared. So social connections are critical, and for all of us here in the Valley, figuring out how to try to help communities thrive and get some of that social cohesion back will be just as powerful as anything that we can do as far as from a healthcare standpoint. Another really important piece of all of that is the importance of ikigai. Has anybody ever heard the word ikigai before? A couple of people? It's another Blue Zones term. It comes from the Okinawan Blue Zone, and it means, why do you get up in the morning? Like, what are you passionate about? What makes you sing? Like, what makes your life worthwhile? And for people who can identify what that ikigai is, it could be your vocation, it could be an avocation, it could be volunteering, it could be your family. Like, it's different for everyone. But for people who can identify what is their sense of purpose, what makes them want to get up and do things in the morning, those people lived longer and stayed more mentally alert as they aged than those who could not identify an ikigai. And they had a reduced risk for all-cause mortality and all cardiovascular events. So having that sense of purpose seems to do something internally, whether it decreases our inflammation or whatever it's doing in our brains, keeping those neurotransmitters going. Having a sense of purpose is really important. And volunteers are great with this. They actually score higher in life satisfaction, well-being, they have less symptoms of depression, anxiety, and pain. So if people really don't have an ikigai, think about volunteering. That's a great way to start because that's a good one to sort of build on. Okay, this all sounds great, right? All these different pillars, but does it work in the real world? Well, we know for countries that live and kind of have lifestyles different than us, it's definitely working. For example, coronary artery disease is almost non-existent in the African population in Uganda. Like, not at all. You could not be a cardiothoracic surgeon there. You would have nothing to do, really. And it's probably very much related to the fact that the middle-aged male total cholesterol average there is 145. Normal cholesterol, normal in the United States, is considered 200. And that's not necessarily good, but a lot of people have it significantly higher than that. So seems like total cholesterol 150 or below makes us heart attack proof or pretty close. So that's how they are in Uganda, not because they genetically have low cholesterol, but because of the lifestyle that they live. In the Cornell China study, that's T. Colin Campbell's big epic about looking at cancer rates and heart disease rates between China and rural China, especially, and America and England, they found that the mortality rate of American men for coronary artery disease is 16.7 times higher versus rural Chinese men. For women, it's 5.6 times higher. So significantly more heart disease in the United States than in China. But if people from China move to the United States, within a generation or two, they have our heart disease rates. So it's not the genetics, it's how they're living. And if you look at the Adventist health study, they found that people who are the vegetarian Adventists, they have a 55% decreased risk of high blood pressure. So it is working out in the real world if we're utilizing these pillars of lifestyle medicine. One of my favorite studies, though, is this study that looked at just 4 simple, but not maybe easy, but simple lifestyle factors. And they looked at 23,000 middle-aged participants and said, okay, what's their BMI? If it's less than 30, that means they could be overweight but would not be classified as obese. Did they smoke? Were they participating in 3.5 hours per week or more of physical activity, so like 30 minutes a day? And was their dietary pattern something that was high in fruits and vegetables, whole grains, they knew the song apparently, and low in red meat consumption? So not a vegetarian diet, just a more plant forward or plant slant. And they followed them and found that for the people that could say yes to all 4 of those factors, they had a 78% decreased risk of developing all chronic disease compared to people who said 0 of those factors. I mean, 78%. Again, this is like a longevity jackpot. This is something that I wish we had access to as physicians. We don't as far as pills or procedures, but we all have access to it as far as our lifestyle habits. So I'm just curious if you guys have any guesses. How many Americans can say yes to all 4 of those factors? What percentage? What do you guys think? 35? 10? I see 5. I see 20. 2.7%. I know, right? I know. It's amazing to think about. But I think that really speaks to why we have such a chronic disease epidemic, is that just out of those 4, only 2.7% of Americans can say yes to that. Now, the American Heart Association has a similar kind of way of looking at things. They call it the Simple 7. And they say if you don't use tobacco, you eat a healthy diet, you're physically active, maintain a healthy body weight, manage your blood pressure even with medication, control your cholesterol and reduce your blood sugar even if it's with medication. If you can say yes to 4 of those things, you decrease your risk of heart attack by 50%. But only 1% of Americans can say yes to all of that. And then the American Heart Association said, oh, well, sleep is important too. So now they call it the Essential 8, which is getting healthy sleep. So if only less than 1% could do the 7, I'm pretty sure that we're even less when we think about getting all of the Essential 8. So we know that this is something that definitely works out in the real world. And this is an example of a place called Albert Lea, which is a small town in Minnesota who went through a Blue Zones project, which is something that is going to be happening here in the Lehigh Valley, centered in Allentown for starters, but hopefully going out to Easton and Bethlehem as well. That Lehigh Valley Health Network and some of the city of Allentown and some of the other people in the Allentown community are really focusing on. So you might be hearing more about Blue Zones over the next year or so. This was a place that they decided to do a Blue Zones project, and these were the interventions that they did. They improved the infrastructure for walkable, bikeable transportation to nudge people into doing more physical activity. They changed the food environment so that restaurants were really encouraged to offer at least 3 plant-based entrees, and doesn't mean that they didn't have the other stuff too, but they just had more opportunity for people to make those choices. And they also changed the default side option for sandwiches and stuff like that to fruit from French fries. Not that you couldn't get French fries or chips, but you had to ask for it, as opposed to the opposite, where it used to be the default and you had to ask for the fruit cup or something like that. The schools stopped using candy as fundraisers and stopped using unhealthy snacks as rewards for people doing a good job. And about 25% of the citizens, it was about 20,000 people in Albert Lea, so 25% of them signed a healthy lifestyle pledge. What happened? They lost a combined of 7,280 pounds over 18 months. There was a 40% decrease in the healthcare costs associated with the people that worked for the city, because they were able to monitor that. And there was a gain of about 3.2 years of increased life expectancy based on changes in biometrics in that community. So what I want you to take away from that is lifestyle habits are contagious, and what the people around us are doing, we are more likely to be doing too. So if we can help set up these healthy nudges and choice architecture in our community, more of us will just default into basically having a healthier, longer, more vital life. So how can you live like a centenarian? First, eat a predominantly whole food, plant-based diet. Doesn't have to be 100%, but definitely plant slant. Enjoy frequent physical activity. Prioritize restorative sleep. I think that's one of the hardest ones for a lot of us. Nurture your social connections. Engage in healthy stress management activities. Avoid risky substances like tobacco and excessive alcohol. We didn't talk about that a lot today. I think most of us have a good handle on that those things are not going to be healthy for us, but it's important to keep in mind. And then honor your ikigai. So I'm going to just put up here some additional resources you guys could think about looking at as far as TED Talks and things like that, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you. Any questions? Oh, I got one here. Go ahead, sir. Okay, so he asked about a CRP test, which is a C-reactive protein test. There's different versions of it. The one that I typically use is called a high-sensitivity CRP test, a HS-CRP test. And what the high-sensitivity CRP shows, it's a measure of inflammation in your body. But it's not a specific measure of this is what's causing the inflammation. So it's kind of like a thermometer. Will tell you have a fever, but won't tell you why you have a fever. It'll just tell you have a fever. That's kind of how high sensitivity CRP is. Now we know that people that have an elevated high sensitivity CRP are more at risk for heart disease. They're also more at risk for other metabolic problems and chronic disease. So as far as how do we use it, it's kind of a risk stratifier in a way, so that if you get your high sensitivity CRP back and it's less than 1, we're like, nice, that's good. That's a good thing. But if you get it and it's above like 6 or above 10, that's concerning, but we don't know why it's higher than that. So we have to look further into why it's higher than that. The other thing I want to say, though, is that your high sensitivity CRP fluctuates very rapidly day to day based on what's going on. So if you now have the flu, your high sensitivity CRP is going to be up. And then when you get better, it'll come back down. If you go and run a marathon, you get your blood tested a day or two later, your high sensitivity CRP is going to be up because of all of the kind of like micro muscle damage. So it's one of those things that it can give you some information, better to follow it over time. And it's one of the things that then if it comes back high, you need to talk with your physician about why might that be, because there's not just one way to deal with it. So thank you for that question. Yes, go ahead.
So then how do you get the community, restaurants, etc., to buy into, instead of offering French fries, offering more fruits and vegetables? How do you get that buy-in?
Such a great question. So how do we get community buy-in to get restaurants to make the default choice be the healthier choice? And there has to be a bunch of different strategies for this. One of the things, though, that we need to think about is we can vote with our dollars. Like, they are bringing in what we are choosing to buy. And a great example of that is that Panera changed around how they made their sandwiches when the labeling for the Affordable Care Act came out and the labeling requirements, and people realized, they're like, oh my gosh, there's 54 grams of fat in that sandwich, and people started shifting their buying habits, and Panera changed because of that. The hardest part, though, is in communities where it makes more sense for the small businesses to have the French fries or the hot dogs or the what, and I'm not saying that any of these foods are like never, 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 but if they're more likely to be able to make a living on the foods that are maybe going to be more inflammatory, that's a rough thing to try to ask a small business owner to do. So we have to, as a community, be changing what the social norms and what our requests are. So for example, it used to be very normal to see doctors smoking cigarettes in the hospital. Like they used to actually have cigarettes in the gift shop in the hospitals. Now that is completely unacceptable, right? Like if you saw a doctor walking down the hall smoking a cigarette, well, they'd lose their job. Like that's not an okay thing. That shifted over the course of my lifetime. The same thing as far as seatbelts. Seatbelts used to be like, that's nice, go ahead, have your seatbelt. But it wasn't something that everybody did. I remember sitting in the back seat and like falling all over the place as a kid because like that wasn't what we had. And now, if you don't have your kid in a car seat, like there's a social stigma to that. So I give you these examples not to say that it is easy, but to say that it is possible for us as a community to no longer think it's okay to just have to think that, how should I put it this way? I don't want to demonize or disparage anybody because it's just easier a lot of times to grab your kid some junk food and give it to them or grab yourself, because you're running around. It takes more thought and planning to make the healthy choice at this point. And that's part of what Kellen Foundation and the Blue Zones Project is all about, is making the healthy choice easier. And that requires a community effort. So whether there's subsidies involved or even better, it's coming from the grassroots of the community. That's part of what we like to do with Kellen Foundation with the elementary schools, is getting the kids like enjoying and experiencing eating some of the food that they grow from their garden and some of the apples and some of the different stuff we bring in the mobile market. Then we actually have kids dragging their parents to the mobile market and saying, hey, these are the guys that talk about real food, and we want to have, like whatever, the melon or the whatever we have at that point. So little steps at a time, I think we'll get there. And it's a mix of advocacy and policy that I think can work that way. It's a great question. Yeah. In the back, and then I'll come to you. Yeah. So that's a great question about supplements, and especially what I call nutraceuticals, which is saying like, oh, all of these, greens are healthy foods in a pill. Is it for people who are having a so-so diet, is it better to at least try that, or are they just gimmicky? And unfortunately, there is no oversight to that type of an industry. So we really don't know what is in any individual brand of supplements. But there was a study done a while ago where I think it was a chemistry department in one of the colleges, went to a health food store and got something like 17 to 20, I can't remember how many, different forms of ginkgo biloba, different supplements, ran it through a gas chromatographer to see how much ginkgo biloba was actually in it. Yeah, it was 20, because 17 of the pills had none. So it said it, but none. And out of the other 3, they were not necessarily of the amount that said it was, because there's just no oversight. So my preference is for people to get their nutrients from real food, because I really can't say whether a supplement is going to be helpful or not. Having said that, I don't feel necessarily the same about iron if somebody's iron deficient. I don't feel the same about vitamin B12 or vitamin D if they're deficient in that, because especially if you use a brand that is, it has the good manufacturing seal and is a relatively reputable brand in the United States, it's likely that they actually have the iron or they actually have the vitamin B12. But when I look at like the big, have this and it'll give you all the fruits and vegetables that you need in one serving, I don't think there's any evidence that that is going to give you the same health outcomes as eating the food would. Same thing with fiber supplements. Fiber supplements would maybe be better than nothing, but it's not going to give you the same outcome as eating the beans and the greens and the fruits and the veggies and the whole grains. So excellent question. And unfortunately, I don't think we can trust necessarily the supplements to give us what they say they're going to. Yes, go ahead. Uh-huh. Yeah, so the question is, for the study that was looking at when you're not getting enough sleep, how what they call the transcriptome, which is the epigenetic changes on your chromosomes, how it showed how they changed when you're not getting enough sleep. Can they change back? And the answer is yes, they can change back. So that's the nice thing about epigenetics. Epigenetics, we're born with our DNA, right? We got our DNA, but we're also born with proteins that are around that DNA, which is what makes up our chromosomes. And it's really on the protein level where epigenetics is like little light switches, turning genes on, turning genes off, making them more transcribed, making them less transcribed. And our lifestyle habits have a big impact on those switches. So going back to getting more sleep, you can improve and change what is going on in your epigenetics. So great question. I think there was another. Yes, go ahead.
I just want to ask more about that Blue Zone project and involvement in schools. Like my child, like his school lunchtime, he gets about 10 to 15 minutes to eat. So even those healthier options, he doesn't always get to eat them. And when he was younger, he would tell me, Mom, I had to throw my apple away or I had to throw my carrots away because he just didn't have that time. So like, is that going to be part of that Blue Zone project, is kind of encouraging those healthier styles within the schools? Because I feel like that's what really holds my son and my daughter. Eventually will be pulling her away from those habits because of what the school is doing.
Such a great question. Yeah, so I mean, our kids are spending a very large majority of their time in the schools, and so that's a great place to be able to shift to healthier choices. But if the structure is set up to kind of make it harder, that's rough for kids to combat. And I feel what you're saying, because Kellin Foundation is in the schools, not in the school cafeterias. That is a challenging place to change. We've been trying to change that for probably about 20 years now. But teaching in the classrooms, and we see that stress of that. My mom was a teacher in the Easton School District for a long time, and she used to call it the chew and choke. Like that's what lunchtime was, because that's all you had time to do. I really feel for our administrators and our teachers, because they are in a situation where the structure of the school day is kind of set for them, and they have so many requirements that they have to do, that we would need to change that from a higher policy level, not like an individual school level. And as far as whether the Blue Zones project is going to address that or not, I'm not sure, because they're just starting here in the Lehigh Valley, but it's definitely a great thing for us to try to look at. The issue, I think, is then how do you make that work throughout the entire schools, all of them, all the elementary schools and all the, because the same thing happens in high schools. When my kids were at Easton Area High School, there was a salad and like kind of healthier sandwich line, but it took so long to go through that you could just grab the pizza and the burger and the French fries. And so most people, you didn't have enough time to do it. So you are absolutely correct. We're setting up the wrong incentives, but we need to get to the point where we're looking above the individual schools, because they're just following the rules that are set up for them. When we first started Kellin Foundation, I was making we were doing presentations for the different school boards, and I was trying to convince, based on the sleep stuff that we were talking about, that I was trying to convince school later start times for teenagers, because there's good data in other states where they've made later start time for teenagers, that it decreases truancy, and improves behavioral issues, and improves the grades, like, so they actually do better on standardized testing. And so all we would really have to do is shift it, maybe 30 minutes, 45 minutes, and even flip so that the elementary school kids went first instead of the high school kids went first, because elementary school kids get up earlier. Anyway, we were having this whole discussion, and they said, absolutely not. Does anybody have an idea why they said, absolutely not, we could not do that? Sports is exactly what they said. They said we could not do that because either every school in the valley needs to do it, or we can't do it because it'll mess up the sports schedule. So I think what we have to do is be advocates for this and say, we've created this system that nudges us into unhealthy choices, and especially for our kids. We've set it up so that our kids are in an unhealthy, they're being nudged in default ways to be less healthy. So how can we switch that? This is not physics. It's not like a law of nature that this is how the world runs. So we should be able to keep trying to move in that direction, and hopefully the blue zones will help bring more people together to do that. Yes, go ahead. Yeah. Oh, to sleep better. So if you're not getting enough sleep at night and it's because you're having trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, because a lot of times why people are not getting enough sleep is just not getting it to bed on time because they've got other stuff going on. But if it's more that you're having a hard time falling asleep, there's a couple of big things as far as how our body knows it's time to go to sleep. One is that light, and especially blue light coming from screens, our phones, our computers, our TVs, tells our brain to wake up. It hits something called the reticular activating system, and and the suprachiasmatic nucleus that goes, wake up! This is time to be awake, and it's very difficult to fall asleep. So one of the things that's important is getting off of all screens, preferably for at least an hour, maybe 2, before bedtime, but at least an hour, and starting to dim the lights in your house so that you don't have bright light, so that your brain starts to go, oh, it's time to go to sleep. I'm going to put that melatonin out there that we make ourselves to say it's time to go to sleep. So decreasing, getting off of screens, decreasing light. Another thing is that our body goes to sleep best in a cool environment, not a hot environment. So decreasing, if you can, the temperature in your bedroom can make a big difference. And then thinking about, is there any other distractions in your bedroom? Noise, light in your bedroom. People don't realize how many light switches or light strips they have, plugged in. When you fall asleep, you don't see them. But then there's that light that if you wake up in the middle of the night, you can see that they're out there. That's actually impacting your retina, even though you're not, your eyes are closed. So some things like also decreasing caffeine after usually lunchtime is about, if you're having trouble falling asleep, not having caffeine after lunchtime. And alcohol is a big one that we need to be careful of with sleep because it helps us fall asleep, but it messes up our sleep architecture so that we don't stay asleep. So the rule of thumb is to not have, basically if you're gonna have one drink, it's gonna take you at least 2 hours before you're gonna be able to metabolize that and get it out of your system for sleeping. There are other things too, like exercising earlier in the day. Exercise the day of really helps with us getting to sleep well. And there's a bunch of other things that we could talk about too. But sleep hygiene has to do with, and sleep hygiene meaning helping you fall asleep, decrease the lights, decrease your screens, get off your screens, watch the alcohol and the caffeine, exercise earlier in the day, and decrease the temperature in your bedroom. And those are some good ways to start. Well, staying asleep, it depends on, so substances, caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, those wake you up in the middle of the night, so trying to decrease those. But if you wake up and it's because your mind is kind of swirling, sometimes a good way to help with that is to write, journal before you go to bed. What are all the things that you're thinking about that you're like, oh, I have to do this, I'm stressed out about that. Kind of write them down on a notebook by the bed and then tell yourself, that'll be there tomorrow. And try and go to sleep. So journaling can help with that mind swirl that we get sometimes. Yes, go ahead. That's a good one too. So she said that her doctor talked about not drinking fluids too close to bedtime and not eating too close to bedtime. And that is a really good point. Trying to cut off the food and the liquids a couple hours before bedtime. So if you're going to bed at like 11, probably cutting off by 8, maybe 7, because if you have a lot of food in your stomach, you lie down, you can get reflux and heartburn from that. Just even the digestion stuff can keep you awake. And then if we're drinking too many fluids, then we have to get up and go to the bathroom. So that's another reason that we might not stay asleep. So excellent point. Yes. Any other? Yes, go ahead. Yes. So what we're talking about here is, it doesn't matter how much you're eating at certain times of day. And there's some good data that looks at trying to eat more of your calories earlier in the day and not as much later in the day. So there's a saying that goes like this. It says, eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. And that seems to really be the best for us metabolically, to eat more of our food in the morning and at lunchtime and less as we get closer to bedtime. Unfortunately, that's not the way American society is set up. You know, like many people skip breakfast because they're like running out the door. Maybe they have some lunch and then they eat the majority of their calories after 6 p.m. And that is not great for sleeping, nor is it great for our metabolism. So, good point. Anybody else? Oh, there we go. Got that one. Go ahead. So the question about when should you exercise earlier in the day, the goal is to exercise at least 4 hours before you're going to fall asleep so that your body is able to kind of calm down and go to sleep. Other than that, it really depends on when it works in your schedule. It's great to exercise in the morning. It wakes you up, so it's good for your energy, it's good for your metabolism. But if you don't have time to exercise in the morning, it's still great to exercise at lunchtime or right after work. It's not so great to exercise like 2 hours before you're going to go to bed because it may delay the time of when you're going to be able to fall asleep. So great question. Do I have anybody else? All right. Thank you all so much for your attention and for your great questions. And I am so glad that we have all of you here in the Lehigh Valley to try to help make the healthy choice the easy choice and to build the community that we all need to thrive. So thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.